and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation. Here on the channel, you can find podcasts, interviews, and content on a whole variety of subjects. We have ongoing series on mental health in sport, conspiracy theories, a new series into the serial killer files, as well as monthly shows on films and TV. And we also have a weekly show on football, the Andy Campbell Championship show, as well as a monthly show on MMA. We have new guests every week. We have new shows Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if you'd like to check out any of the previous shows, you can find video versions at youtube.com/acepodcastnation, or all the audio versions are at the usual podcasting sites: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and alike. Far too many to name. So today's episode is another in our series on mental health. In this series, we feature a different mental health condition each episode. We speak to medical professionals or people who suffer with the conditions, or sometimes family members, parents, whatever it may be. Today's episode is focused on schizophrenia. I don't pretend to know a great deal about the condition personally, but I am eager to, with all the shows, to focus and learn about the different mental health conditions, hopefully educate other people as well as myself, raise awareness, break down stigmas, and most of all, hopefully help some people along the way. Joining me to help me learn some more and understand the impact and challenges faced daily by someone suffering with schizophrenia is Bill MacPhee. Welcome, Bill. How are you today?
Hey, I'm good, Sai. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. I just realized then I should have checked. Did I pronounce your name right then?
Yeah, Bill MacPhee. Yeah, no problem.
That's all right. I meant to check beforehand.
It's M-A-C though. A lot of people spell it M-C-P-H-E, but it's actually M-A-C-P-H-E.
Ah, that's okay.
Yeah.
See, because when I first got in contact with you and I was reading it, I was in my head I was pronouncing it McAfee, but it's McAfee. So thank you for joining me. I do appreciate you finding the time to speak to me today. The obviously the fundamental aim with these shows, which we do on mental health, is to help raise awareness, educate people on different mental health conditions, and then B, hopefully reach anybody who may be affected by the conditions. They may be suffering in silence, they may feel alone, and it's just kind of, I feel that the best thing to do for all mental health conditions is try and get people talking as much as possible, and that's the aim. So go on.
Sure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story then, Sai.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm 57 years old. I'll turn 57 at the end of the month. And I was actually diagnosed when I was 24 years old. So I've been living with schizophrenia for over 30 years or so.
Wow.
And schizophrenia, actually, the word means, a lot of people think that it means multiple personality or different personalities and that. But the word schizophrenia actually means split from reality or out of reality. And another name for out of reality is basically being in a psychosis. So my story goes way back. Basically, with schizophrenia, there's three legs to it. One, there's genetic component to it. Another, there's a biochemical component to it. And another, there's a stressor or a triggering part to it. And part of the genetic factor is that my mom actually suffered from, it was just, we didn't know it back then, it was called manic depressive. And she was, now today, manic depressive is called bipolar illness. But back then they called it manic depressive. And my mom was very sick many times as I was growing up as a kid. My mom was in and out of the hospital, and she had a rough time. And so there was mental illness running in my family as I got older. However, so what happened? So there is a genetic component. Also, so what happened is basically when I was 24, I got a girl pregnant, and I suppressed that. I didn't tell anybody, and I tried to keep that as a secret. And it was really heavily on my mind. And so I started to kind of look for forgiveness, and I started to dive into theology. And what would happen is that I'd actually start getting words like floating off the page of the Bible and expanding and contracting. and making I would see visions on the wall. I would see like the faces of different faces distorting and all that, and I was starting to get sick, but I didn't realize that. A lot of times people with mental illness do not realize that they're sick. And with schizophrenia, you have what's known as positive and negative symptoms. And what that means is that when you have positive symptoms, these are symptoms that are added to your personality that shouldn't be there. Like, for example, if you hallucinate, or if you hear voices, or if you see things, hallucinations and delusions and paranoia, these things shouldn't be with us normally, but they are with schizophrenia. So it's known as positive symptoms. As well as with schizophrenia, you have what's known as negative or deficit symptoms. And these symptoms are symptoms that are lacking from your personality that should be there. So you have a lack of motivation, a lack of energy, a lack of drive. You just are lacking these things. And so you have positive and negative symptoms. So my symptoms when I was going through my break was that I was very delusional, and I just very delusional. And what ended up happening is that I ended up being picked up by the police and taken to the hospital and different things like that. So it's a very, very debilitating illness. So I was actually hospitalized 6 different times. I lived in 3 different group homes, and I had a suicide attempt. I was very, 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 very ill, and I was basically 5 years on the couch dealing with the depression and dealing with my negative symptoms is all. So really, the thing is with schizophrenia is that a lot of times we don't know we're sick. See, a lot of people might say, well, mental illness is just the same as physical illness. You have to have diabetes and you got to take your insulin, or if you have a high blood pressure or heart disease, you got to take over it. But that's actually not true. The reason for that is that mental illness can't be really compared to physical illness, because when you have a physical illness, say I fell down and I broke my arm, and my bone is sticking out of my arm and there's blood, my brain would tell me, Bill, you have a broken arm, you got to get to the hospital and get that looked at. So basically what happened is that with that injury, the brain recognizes that there's an injury and needs to get help. But the thing with mental illness, and especially illnesses like paranoia, illnesses like schizophrenia, illnesses like bipolar, is our mind is broken, our brain is broken, and the brain doesn't know that the brain is sick, that it's sick. And so really that's the difference between a mental illness and a physical illness, that physically we know we're sick, but when we have a mental illness, we don't realize that we're sick, and everything seems to be true. And that's the main difference between physical and mental illness. Now, saying that, I don't know if you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, and Ron Howard produced that movie, and it was a great movie. And I had symptoms just like in that movie, where I would look at the wall in Beautiful Mind, and letters and words became bold, and they came off the wall and everything like that. And those things were exactly things that was happening to me. And obviously you think, well, gee, Bill, I never thought I'd be mentally ill. I thought that at that time I was 24 years old, and I thought if I was going to be mentally ill, I'd be mentally ill as a child. I didn't know you can get mental illness at age 24. So with all these supernatural things happening around here, I start getting an idea into my head that I'm a prophet or a Jesus Christ or something like that. And my health and just deteriorated quite a bit. So I was really in a lot of psychosis, split from reality, and very, very ill that time with the positive symptoms.
Yeah, and I mean, it must have been a very scary, scary period for you. And like, I understand now, you can look back and you can talk about it, and you can say, this was the symptoms, and this was happening and this was happening. But obviously it sounds like obviously I've got no experience with schizophrenia in terms of what the symptoms feel like, but it sounds
Right.
like almost your brain is tricking itself in, because so like the best way I can try to explain what I mean is like if I saw, say, I don't know, if I see like a purple elephant now, I would think that my brain would tell me that, there's not a purple elephant there. So there must be, I must have been sort of drugged or having a reaction to something, or I must be ill. Whereas with illnesses like schizophrenia, your brain isn't doing that. So the things that you're seeing, like you said, you fully believe that they're happening. So your brain doesn't differentiate between kind of I can't think of the word, like almost logical thinking, in that it doesn't, you don't think, oh, there's not words coming off the wall, or there's not words coming off the page. You just see it and completely, your brain
Right.
believes it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You
I'm
you
sorry, I didn't
definitely
explain that very
exactly.
well.
Yeah. You just hit on it. Your brain doesn't believe these things are there. You think they're real. And what happens is a lot of times things happen. Like we may question things. We may be paranoid and question things and all that. But a lot of times coincidences happen that back up our paranoia. So, for example, if I went over to a new friend's house or something and went up into his apartment, he'd say, "Well, what kind of music do you like?" And I'd say, "Well, I like Neil Diamond and Olivia Newton-John and things like that." And he'd go and he'd pull out from his record album, an Olivia Newton-John set. And you think, how can this person have the same kind of the music you just mentioned and everything? And so the paranoia kicks in and the
Yeah,
coincidence. And then I go downstairs, I get into my car, and on the radio what's playing? But an Olivia Newton-John set or something that he just had. And those things are coincidences, and they happen all the time, but they really back up our paranoia and different things like that. And the thing is, and what we call basically, like I'm very fortunate that I have insight into my illness, but a lot of times people don't have insight into their illness. They just can't. It's just part of their illness that they don't have insight, and it's easy. And you know what? And that's the frustrating part with mental illness. And if I can, it's a frustrating for the parents, it's frustrating for parents and people themselves who have it. And the reason for that, the reason why it's such a difficult illness is that right now I'm here and I'm talking to you, and we're logic. We're talking logical, we're making sense and everything like that. But with people who are mentally ill, they are not logical. Their mind does not make them logical. And all we know is logic, right? So when you have somebody who's talking logic and somebody who's talking not logic, it's they clash, and it can be
yeah,
very, very frustrating. And that's the reason why we have so much homelessness in that around the world, is because people just, it's just not easy. It's a difficult illness, and people don't believe that they're sick, and they don't reach out for help and everything. And I really, moving on with my story, I was very, very devastated with negative symptoms or deficit symptoms. So basically, when I got put into the hospital, I was given different medications, and it takes a while before you get back into reality. But I would get, I'd be trying on medications, and being in a ward, you realize that you're on the ward, the psychiatric ward, and that you're sick, and you're thinking, you're thinking all these things. You're thinking, now, I had no financial security. I lost my job. I lost my house. And I find out I'm just another one out of 100 people with this illness known as schizophrenia. And that's what it is. It's 1% of the population has schizophrenia. So it's quite common. And so with these deficit symptoms, what happened is that I got back into reality with the medication. Okay, it totally brought me back into reality. But then my reality sucked, right? And that's where the negative symptoms kicked in. So I was actually diagnosed in 1987, and I was basically 5 years on the couch dealing with a depression from my illness. And it was terrible. I had a suicide attempt at that time. And actually 50% of people with schizophrenia will try suicide, and actually 10% actually succeed, if you call that a success. So it's a very high number of suicide. But what happened with me is that I was stuck. I was at home. I was on the couch dealing with the depression. I lost my jobs. I tried to go back to work different times, and it didn't work. And just you're on the couch and you're just so depressed, and you're thinking. I used to say this all the time. I used to say, Bill, if things don't change, they're going to stay the same. If things don't change, they're going to stay the same. And I hated my same. I hated being on the couch for 5 years because you're scared. You're thinking to yourself, you're thinking, is 5 years going to turn into 7 years? And is 7 years going to turn into 10 years and all this? Because we see this. This happens to people with mental illness, is that basically, we don't have a life. And that's the goal. The goal with mental illness and your life is to try to create some kind of life for yourself. And what I did is I can remember being on the couch and thinking, you know what? Oh, if only my parents had a different job, or my mom had a different education, or if I would have did this job, or if I would have did this in the past, then I would have been really thinking that, what could have changed? Why am I in this spot now? And I remembered what a grade 7 teacher said to me. She said to me before, she said, Bill, if you don't learn how to write properly in life, you'll never amount to anything. And what she meant about my writing was my penmanship. I had very, very poor penmanship. But I took that to heart, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna do something. This lady here says I don't, I'm not gonna amount to anything. And what happened is that I reached out to our local group, our 40 uh, uh, literacy foundation, and I said, listen, I know how to read and write and that, but I want to improve my penmanship. And so Martha, volunteer there, would come over, and after every week we'd do these penmanship exercises. And while Martha took an interest in me and doing these penmanship exercises, um, she said, Bill, she says, I realize you're not doing much, which was an understatement, And I said, yeah, that's true. She said, well, I go to Niagara College at school. And she says, well, why don't you drive with me, take a course and drive with me, and I'll drive you to school. Because at the time, my license was suspended because of my illness, and God knows I had no friends, and Martha was the opposite sex, so just to be with a woman in sight was kind of a plus, But I went to school with Martha. She took her courses, social courses, and I took a photography course. And I went on to join the photography class, and I'd go on the field trips, and I didn't really enjoy it, but I went through the motions. The thing is, with negative symptoms and depression, you don't really enjoy things at all. You just have to force yourself to do things. So the next thing I know, that Martha's on the phone again, and she says, Bill, she says, I'm the 7th chairperson of the 40 Beavers, Cubs, and Scouts, and we need a treasurer. How would you like to be our treasurer? And all these times that you have to go out and everything, you think, oh my God, I got to wash my hair, and I got to brush my teeth, and I got to shave, which is hard to do with negative symptoms. And so I kind of kicked around and said, okay, Martha, I'll come to your stupid meeting, kind of thing. And I'd shave and I'd wash my hair, all these things are hard to do with negative symptoms. But I went to that, and that was where I call my turning point for my recovery. And the reason it was a turning point is because I met Martha's husband. I met her friends who were like part of the group, and I met Peter, who eventually I started playing racquetball and squash with. And really what it did is it gave me a whole new circle of friends. It gave me a whole new circle of friends, of people who accepted me for who I was and not really what I had. So now I have a few activities that I'm doing, and I have a few friends that I have now. But all my friends seem to be like they're all working and everything. And I'm thinking, well, that's got to be the next spot, getting back to work. But in the past, I used to be a printer, and I tried to get back to work. I did it a lot. I tried to start a lawn care company. I delivered pizza for a while, just trying to get different jobs and get back into the groove of things. And it just so happened that one day I got interested in politics, and our town councils were held at the meetings were held at the library, the local library. And what I did is I found a book at the library, and it was called 101 Ways How to Start a Business with Little or No Capital. And I said, that's me, I have no capital. And I read a scenario in the book where before VCRs were invented, this one woman watched 3 separate television stations, and she watched the soap operas, and she ended up doing a newsletter on what was happening in the soap operas and selling it to her working friends. Well, I read that and a light bulb came on, and I said, well, you know what? I probably can't do something on soap operas, but I could probably do something on schizophrenia. So that was in 1993, and I ran with the idea. I took some business courses, and then I ran with the idea. And in March of 1994, I launched a publication called SZ Magazine, and it was a magazine on mental health, focusing on schizophrenia. And basically, I did that for 23 years. I did that for 23 years, publishing that business. And now, when the digital age came, when everything was going digital, I kind of wound it down then, because it was a different. Everybody, lots of competition after that, as you probably know with your podcast. But it's true is that I did that for 23 years. Now I'm semi-retired. And my hobby is I sell my book. So I've written a book. My book is called To Cry a Dry Tear, Bill MacPhee's Journey of Hope and Recovery with Schizophrenia. And that book, if you go to my website, billmacphee.ca, you can download the first chapter for free. And it's called, my website again is billmacphee.ca, MACPHEE. And I do that. So that's what I do now. But I have a good quality life. I mean, I have 3 children. I like my life. I try to keep things as stressless and as simplified in my life and that. But I'm a lot of people think with mental illness, there's no quality of life, or you can't recover, or you can't go back. And that's what I do. I kind of break the stigma, and I kind of tell people that, yes, there is life after mental illness.
Yeah, and that's good to hear, because one of the things I'm going to talk to you about in a minute is the portrayal of people with schizophrenia in TV programs and films. It's always quite negative, but obviously, especially for people watching this who maybe have been recently diagnosed with schizophrenia, it's good for them to be able to see that you've gone on after the initial period of it was difficult dealing with it for a few years and getting your head around it perhaps, and that sort of thing. You've gone on and you've made friends, you've got children, you started the magazine, and now you've written a book as well. So I mean, you've been very successful. So just because someone's been diagnosed with schizophrenia doesn't mean that they're going to be hospitalized for the rest of their life, or they're never going to be able to work again. There's ways around it, I think. So I'll tell you what, if you don't mind, if I could take you back to, I think it was 1987, you said, wasn't it, when you first got diagnosed? So just before that, just before you had the official diagnosis, if you like, were you getting the sort of hallucinations or the words coming from on the wall and from the books? Was that just before you went to the doctors there, or was there other sort of like a build-up of symptoms which caused you
right so Cy, there is a buildup of symptoms. So basically, with schizophrenia, you can have basically what's known as slow onset schizophrenia or acute schizophrenia. And what that means is that some people say in their early years, say if they're like, say 15, 16, 17, and that they have symptoms, but they may be in the basement, they isolate themselves, but nobody notices a big difference. They're gradually, people know there's something wrong, but they don't know that it's mental illness. With me, I had acute schizophrenia. So all of my symptoms came up and were built up and came within 6 months. So I isolated myself from my parents. I was very, very odd behavior. And what ended up happening is I ended up going down the highway and, thinking, not knowing really what I'm thinking. I'm thinking I got to prove myself to God and everything like that. So I go out in the middle of the highway and I start walking toward traffic. and I say, and I'm the headlights are coming, trucks are coming, they're blowing their horns and everything, get out of the way. And so I was out there. It was the coldest night of the year. Again, popped into my mind that, Bill, you don't need anything. You don't even need the clothes on your back. And I ended up starting stripping and taking off all the clothes on that I had. And eventually I was totally naked. And, I guess I still had my sense of humor a little bit, because I was underneath a street light, and I looked up and I said, "Beam me up, Scotty," and Scotty, he didn't beam me up, but he did call the police, and Scotty called the police, and they came, and you don't know, and in my mind, I'm thinking, because you're delusional and everything, and I'm thinking these police officers coming to get me are modern day Roman guards coming away to get me, who's supposed to be like a Christ. So you can imagine the fear you had when you think you're being dragged away to be killed, to be crucified or to be slaughtered, right? And so that was how I got into the psych ward. So no, I didn't recognize the symptoms and everything like that. And I didn't really know that I didn't have insight into my illness until the medication kicked in. And it's almost like I went from being out of reality, slowly coming across, and getting right back into reality. But then that's when you got to pick up the pieces of your life, and that's the hard part. And so I was basically, you'd say I was forced hospitalizations, and I was hospitalized 6 different times because my medication stabled me. But you're always thinking, do I need medication? Do I need this medication? And I went off my medication. And in 6 months' time, I was in psychosis again, and my mind tricked me, and I was back in the hospital again after that. And that's very good. Medication, in my opinion, medication is the foundation. You got to get back into reality. And in my opinion, getting back into reality means some kind of medication. And I went off my medication, so they didn't trust me to take my medication. So they started me on an injectable medication, and I get that every 4 weeks, and I've been taking that medication faithfully every 4 weeks for, like I say, like 30 years basically. And it keeps me in reality. If I was to go off it, most likely in 6 months, and the nature of the illness, it would come back because of the nature of the illness. Yeah. So I'm not cured. I still have schizophrenia. I'm not cured. There's no cure for it, but symptoms can be controlled, and you can live a good life. It's not easy, but you can.
So you're managing it, basically, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So first of all, let me say that I'm very, very thankful that on that night you didn't get hit by a truck or a car in the dark, because that could have ended very badly.
Yeah.
So I'm very pleased that luckily the drivers had their wits about them, and obviously that must have been terribly traumatic to kind of, first of all, the initial, like you say, you feel like you're being dragged off by the equivalent of Roman guards. You feel like they're gonna, execute you or slaughter you or crucify you. So that in itself is, terrifying.
Yes.
And then I'm assuming that they would have given you some sort of sedative. You'd have been hospitalized, and then you would have probably gradually come around over the next few, days, as their medications start work. Now, with all mental illness, whether it be a bipolar, depression, anxiety, ADHD, any mental illness, the initial period of starting medication is hit or miss, because different medications work differently for different people.
Yes.
So the example I would use is my oldest son has got ADHD. So when he was diagnosed, they tried him on a few different medications before he found one which really worked for him. And those periods where he was on medication but it wasn't really working, it felt like to us as parents that he may as well have not been on medication, because it wasn't really, making enough difference that you could tell he was on medication and feeling a bit better in himself and finding things a bit easier. But compared to, when he found one which works, did it take was it a long period for you finding the right medication?
Yeah, yeah, it was. It is trial and error. Like, for example, when I first got in hospital, they started me off with Haldol, which is an older drug, and that drug, I was always had the sensation that I had to go to the washroom. I was just pacing. It made me antsy, going back and forth there. So then they tried me on another medication, and didn't work for a while. And then they started me on a medication that I was on. And basically, what happened then is that taking this medication, I eventually, got back in reality. I was out of reality and slowly coming back. Like the TV wasn't talking to me anymore. I wasn't getting messages of the radio playing anymore. My paranoia went away. I didn't have delusion. I wasn't delusional. Things were making sense again. And so after a few medications, the one they put me on actually started to work. And so that was working. But then, like I say, I went off it. I got feeling better. I got feeling good. And I went off that medication. I relapsed again, and they didn't trust me to take my medication. So that's when I got started on the injection. And my injection has an antipsychotic in it with a little bit of an antidepressant in it. And it works really well for me. So I get that injection. I go to the hospital and get that injection every 4 weeks. And after I get that injection, about 3 days later, it kicks in and I get very lethargic. I get kind of tired where I have to rest a bit more. But then after that, after a couple of days of that, I'm right back to, so-called normal, if there is such a normal. I don't think there is. And the only place is normal is on your drier setting, right? You're normal.
Yeah, that's right.
But I like to tell people, though, I like to tell them that everybody's a little bit neurotic, but not everybody's psychotic.
I like that saying.
Yeah.
So, just as we finish off now, the last sort of 15 minutes or so, I was hoping to ask you a few questions. I had a couple of questions sent to me by someone, which they would like me to ask. But just before we get to the questions, when I did a show on DID or multiple personality disorder with the Chris's, and everyone watching, you can find that show in the mental health playlist on the YouTube channel if you want to look it up. It was a very, very interesting show. But one of the things which came up with the Chris's was that in movies, TV, popular culture, people with DID, and I think it's the same for people with schizophrenic, are nearly always portrayed as violent criminals, aggressive, or serial killers. Now, I must confess, I'd never considered this or the impact that it could have on people with those conditions meeting new people in real life. Now, as I say, I'm guessing it's pretty similar to with schizophrenic. Is it difficult, like that first time when you tell people that you've got schizophrenia? Do they almost expect you to be different to what you are?
Well, Sai, I think what's important is that you're not going to the first person you meet, that's not going to be the first thing out of your mouth,
No,
right? And so you have to guard people, you have to guard yourself a little bit. And yes, the movies are totally Hollywood, and the making of movies is totally biased on schizophrenia. It is very sad the way they portray that, and it is, they're made out to be villains and serial killers and everything like that. That's kind of thing. But really, what I've always done is I've always been honest with my illness. And I think any relationship or any friendship that develops, there's a few things involved, and that is being transparent, it's being honest, and it's being vulnerable, being able to show your vulnerability. And I think if you can do that to anybody, if you can be transparent and you can be honest and you can show your vulnerability, it's easier to make relationships and friends and that. So, but you got to be good. You got to be careful. I mean, I was one time I was writing a person. I was writing a person through a pen pal place, and I told them in one of the letters that I told her that I had schizophrenia, and she wrote back and said, I could have nothing to do with somebody with schizophrenia because my mother had it and I couldn't live that way, kind of thing, But but we talk about the stigma in Hollywood too. But you got to remember, like way back when my mom was dealing with bipolar, when I was a kid, the psychiatry industry, the psychiatrists used to blame the families. They would blame families and everything like that. So the medical model of psychiatry didn't do itself in any favors when there was a period of time when the psychiatrists were blaming it on how people were raised. Now, nobody thinks that today, but the psychiatrists kind of gave themselves a black eye when they're talking that because it's true. They thought it was something different. And then way back in the olden days, they used to give people lobotomies and they used to give people, certain insulin treatments and all kinds of stuff, and that wasn't proven effective and that. And so they got a black history. But in saying that, psychiatry and development of the brain and the study of brain is relatively a young field. It hasn't been a long, it's not like history or geography that's been studied for years and years. The mind has really only been studied in, the 1800s and 1900s and that, so that makes a difference too. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Just one last question on the kind of relationship aspect of it. If you don't mind answering that, is I was going to ask, it's what's like or have you had any like really negative experiences when you've told people that you've got schizophrenia? Has anyone ever reacted badly?
Not too much, but there have been a couple of times in that when you're mentioning that, and then somebody would make a kind of a joke about it or something like that, and it's not really an illness to joke about. It's a very, very serious illness, and it's so common as well, very common illness. And I think that like 1 out of 100 people in a lifetime will get this illness, and it's a costly illness to society as well. It's so it has a bad name to it, kind of thing. It does have a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of awareness and people trying to break the stigma, but it's tough because it is a difficult area. And one of the reasons we have so much homelessness is because that a lot of people who are dealing with mental illness are homeless in that. Now, I just want to say this as well. I mean, when we're talking about the illness, we talk about addictions and homelessness and everything like that. And I tell people, you know what? You can never judge. We should never judge people because people say, oh, they're just drug addicts. You know what? There's a lot of things that like self-medication that went on. Like if you heard voices or you had delusion and you had no idea what you had, you might try street drugs or your own medication to try to get rid of that and that, because so that's what happens a lot of times too, is that because of the mental illness, people start self-medicating and then they become delusional or they become a drug addict and everything like that. And that's why the homelessness is a lot of mental illness in it, a lot of addiction in it, but it's not as easy in black and white as the solutions aren't as easy in black and white as you think. There's a lot of different components to it.
Absolutely. Funnily enough, I recorded the first part of a show on addiction earlier on with a gentleman who he was a councilman. He had a nice house, nice car, nice everything, and he still ended up having addictions, which caused him tremendous trouble later on. But my point being that addictions and mental illnesses, they don't pick the rich or the poor, male or female, right. Black or white, or it can just happen to anyone. And obviously with things like addiction, they can start with like trauma, which is then self-medicated with alcohol or drugs, which can then cause like a mental illness or some type of break. So one of the people who sent in a question, they said, what would your advice be to someone who is worried or they think that a loved one may be schizophrenic, but they're not quite sure how to approach it or what to do next?
Yeah, I think that one of the main things is you have to try to get somebody to look at them, a doctor, whether they can get them to a family doctor or GP or a psychiatrist or something like that. Because definitely that person, if there's a suspicious of something going on, it's not going to get better. It's not going to get better unless you got to get treated. And I know I push medication a lot, but I truly believe that. I truly believe that you got to get rid of that psychosis, those non-logical things that you have. You got to get rid of that. So that's important. And sometimes it's hard to do that, but you have to negotiate that with your loved one. Like if you have something over them, like, if you're providing them their rent for free or buying them groceries, you have to say, listen, I'm doing this for you. So in return, you have to go see that doctor, or you have to go and I'll go with you and everything like that. That's the problem. See right there's that lack of insight, right? That we talked about, that the person doesn't really know they're ill. And that's why mental illness is really a cruel illness. It truly is cruel because your brain doesn't even know that you're ill, unlike a physical illness.
Of course, yeah. So what, same person asked another question actually, which was, what about if someone has been recently diagnosed with schizophrenia, or has a child with schizophrenia who's just been diagnosed, like a teenager, say? What advice would you give them to help them manage that initial period where after the diagnosis, but also then managing the condition on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important to try to keep your stress levels down. I'm a big firm believer of keeping stress down, and I'm a big firm believer of trying to keep your life as simple as possible as well. You mentioned that you had a child. Just to give you some statistics, is that if one spouse in the family has schizophrenia, there's a 10% chance that the sibling or that the child will have schizophrenia. If both parents have schizophrenia, it's a 50% chance that they have that the child be schizophrenic. And then the last one, if there's no schizophrenia in the family or anything, in the immediate family, it's 1 out of 100, just like the general population, the odds. But again, usually a lot of times people who are dealing with mental illness, they have it in their families. They can look back and say, oh, my grandfather or my uncle or a cousin. Many times, not all the time, it's not all the time, but a lot of times it runs in families, just like how cancer runs in families, or high blood pressure runs in families, diabetes runs in families, cancer runs in families, and unfortunately sometimes mental illness runs in families.
Yeah, of course. So just one last question, really. I just occurred to me there when you're answering that previous question. Does like organization help to manage the condition as well? Like, so for you, where you said like you try to live kind of stress free as much as possible, and keep things kind of all calm and that sort of thing. Would being very organized and having like
I think instead of using the word organized, I think the word would be structured, to kind of have a structured life, a routine of habit. I'm a firm believer that there's no such thing as motivation. There is no such thing as motivation, but there is such thing as habit. And if you do your habit and you repeat what you're doing, that can be very, very helpful to create habits that are beneficial for your health. Yeah. So, so Sai, if I can just plug my book one more time, if you don't mind.
I'll put a link.
My book is called To Cry a Dry Tear, Bill MacPhee's Journey of Hope and Recovery with Schizophrenia. And people can download the first chapter of that book if they go to my website, billmacphee.ca. And MacPhee is MacPhee.
Absolutely. And tell the people where they could find you on Twitter as well. What's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, I'm at Bill MacPhee 62, at Bill MacPhee 62.
Okay, cool.
And just go to the website there, my website, billmacphee.ca, and I run a Facebook parent group as well, a page for parents. It's called Helping Parents of Mentally Ill Children on the Facebook group as well.
Oh, right. Okay, I'll check that out. And what I'll do is I'll put in the description to the episode and on YouTube, I'll put links to all your website and your book and everything, so people can check that out. guys, you can check you can check us out on Twitter at acecast_nation, facebook.com/acecastnation, and as I said before, youtube.com/acepodcastnation for the video versions of all our shows and audio versions of all your usual podcasting apps. Bill, thank you ever so much for joining me, and thank you for giving me your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Si. It was a pleasure. Have a great day.
And you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.